Hey, somebody needs to reanimate the sound guy. You have? Excellent. Good morning, afternoon, or evening. You are listening to the Professional Noticer. Hello, everyone. I'm Andy Andrews. Hey, thank you for making me a part of your week. My purpose here today and with every show we do is to play the part of a best friend or coach. I want to help you live the life of your wildest dreams by giving you access to the greatest mentors the world has to offer today. This week, the Professional Noticer is sponsored by wisdomharbor.com. Today, families and school systems all over America are finding wisdomharbor.com's one-of-a-kind streaming service to be the perfect low-cost, high-quality educational tool for their students. Wisdom Harbor's stated responsibility is to create the next greatest generation, starting with your hometown and your school system. For less than $3 a month per teacher, classrooms have access to original content only found on wisdomharbor.com that teaches, entertains, and builds character in young people while creating conversations between young people and the adults in their community. Utilizing video, audio, and the written word, content is delivered in small bites by Grammy winners, CEOs, comedians, chefs, best-selling authors, and Hall of Fame speakers. There are even guitar lessons from an award-winning songwriter. Check it out today and join your friends and neighbors who are already a part of wisdomharbor.com. And isn't it time your schools got involved? wisdomharbor.com, creating America's next greatest generation, starting with your hometown. Observations and answers, that's what we do here on the Professional Noticer, usually. Today, the Halloween edition. This is gonna be fun today. We're gonna tie in some Wisdom Harbor stuff with your enjoyment of the scariest holiday of the year. On wisdomharbor.com, there are about 20 different docs, different categories of information and learning and conversation starters that you can have. And two of those docs are going to be highlighted today. One is the In Other Words doc. It usually uses speeches from history or literature and a deeper explanation of that. And today we're going to highlight an In Other Words with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I think you're going to love this. And then we have also on the audiobooks doc, one that is a story that is performed by one of our contributors, Briley Crisafi, who Briley is an actress that absolutely nails this scary story called The Monkey's Paw. It's an old story, but perfect for Halloween. And I think you're going to find Briley's performance of this story, her narration, I think you're going to love it. And you probably want to play it for your family. So here we go with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Briley Crisafi in The Monkey's Paw. First published in 1818, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein has stood the test of time as a compelling narrative that explores the perils of human ambition and the moral boundaries we dare to cross. The story centers on Victor Frankenstein, a scientist whose persistent effort to unlock the mysteries of life leads him down a dark and dangerous path. What begins as an intellectual pursuit quickly turns into a nightmare, ultimately raising profound questions about the nature of creation, the responsibilities of a creator, and what it truly means to be human. Here is an excerpt from Frankenstein, Chapter 5. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this I had deprived myself of rest and health. I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation, but now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Unable to endure the aspect of the being I had created, I rushed out of the room and continued a long time traversing my bedchamber, unable to compose my mind to sleep. At length, lassitude succeeded to the tumult I had before endured, and I threw myself on the bed in my clothes, endeavoring to seek a few moments of forgetfulness. But it was in vain. I slept indeed, but I was disturbed by the wildest dreams. In other words, Frankenstein is much more than just a horror story. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of overstepping boundaries that were never meant to be crossed, especially when it comes to the power of creation. Victor Frankenstein's decision to create life is not just a scientific experiment gone wrong. It's a profound act of egomania that challenges the natural order and the very role of God as the creator. From the beginning, Victor Frankenstein is driven by an insatiable curiosity. He's fascinated by the mysteries of life and death and becomes obsessed with the idea of unlocking the secret to creating life. In his pursuit, Victor isolates himself from family, friends, and even his own well-being. His obsession blinds him to the moral and ethical implications of his experiment. When he finally succeeds in bringing his creation to life, the reality is far from what he imagined. Instead of the beautiful being he envisioned, he's met with a creature so grotesque he's immediately filled with horror and regret. Shelley's message is clear. There are some boundaries humans were never meant to cross. When we do, the consequences can be devastating. Victor's decision to create life raises significant moral and ethical questions. By attempting to play God, he disrupts the natural order, and the results are catastrophic. His creation, often referred to as the monster or Frankenstein's monster, is not inherently evil. Instead, it's Victor's abandonment of his creation that leads to tragedy. Shelley suggests that with the power of creation comes immense responsibility, a responsibility Victor fails to uphold. His initial reaction to his creation, horror, disgust, and immediate rejection, sets off a chain of events that leads to immense suffering, not just for Victor, but for everyone he loves. The monster, left alone and rejected by its creator, becomes increasingly isolated and bitter. It longs for companionship, understanding, and acceptance, basic human needs that Victor withholds. Shelley challenges us to consider the responsibilities that come with creation or parenthood and the consequences of neglecting those responsibilities. One of the central themes in Frankenstein is the question of what it means to be human. The monster, despite its appearance, exhibits many qualities that are deeply human. It feels pain, loneliness, and a desire for connection. Yet because of its grotesque appearance, it's rejected by society and even by its own creator or father. Shelley forces us to ask some difficult questions. Is it the monster's appearance that makes it inhuman, or is it the way others are treating it? And more broadly, what does it truly mean to be human? Shelley's novel suggests that humanity is not defined by physical appearance, but by the capacity for empathy, compassion, and moral responsibility. The monster's suffering is a direct result of Victor's failure to provide these basic elements of humanity. In this way, she criticizes not only Victor, but society at large for its superficial judgments and lack of compassion. Frankenstein is a timeless story that resonates because it touches on universal themes of creation, responsibility, and the limits of human ambition. For those who believe in God and the sanctity of creation, Frankenstein serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of respecting the natural order and the boundaries set by our Creator. Shelley urges us to consider the ethical implications of our actions, particularly when they involve the power to create or destroy life. It's a story that reminds us that some things are beyond human control, and that humility, compassion, and responsibility are essential qualities in the face of such power. That's Frankenstein, the creation of the monster, in other words. Wisdom Harbour Audio presents The Monkey's Paw by W. Jacobs, narrated by Briley, Crisafi.
Part 1. Outside the night was cold and wet, but in the small living room the curtains were closed and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were playing chess. The father, whose ideas about the game involved some very unusual moves, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary danger that it even brought comments from the white-haired old lady knitting quietly by the fire. "Listen to the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a mistake that could cost him the game after it was too late, was trying to stop his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the son, seriously studying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check." "I could hardly think that he'll come tonight," said his father, with his hand held in the air over the board. "Mate," replied the son. "That's the worst of living so far out," cried Mr. White with sudden and unexpected violence. "Of all the awful out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Can't walk on the footpath without getting stuck in the mud. The road's a river. I don't know what the people are thinking about. I suppose they think it doesn't matter because only 2 houses in the road have people in them." "Never mind, dear," said his wife calmly. "Perhaps you'll win the next match." Mr. White looked up sharply just in time to see a knowing look between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty smile in his thin gray beard. "There he is," said Herbert White as the gate banged shut loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose quickly and, opening the door, was heard telling the new arrival how sorry he was for his recent loss. The new arrival talked about his sadness, so that Mrs. White said, "Tut, tut," and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, heavy-built, strong-looking man, whose skin had the healthy reddish color associated with outdoor life, and whose eyes showed that he could be a dangerous enemy. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing him to his wife and son, Herbert. The sergeant major shook hands and, taking the seat offered by the fire, watched with satisfaction as Mr. White got out whiskey and glasses. After the 3rd glass, his eyes got brighter, and he began to talk. The little family circle listened with growing interest to this visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and brave acts, of wars and strange peoples. 21 years of it," said Mr. White, looking at his wife and son. "When he went away and he was a thin young man. Now look at him." "Oh, he doesn't look to have taken much harm," said Mrs. White politely. "I'd like to go to India myself," said Mr. White, "just to look around a bit, you know." "Better where you are," said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and sighed softly, shook it again. "I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and the street entertainers," said the old man. "What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris?" "Nothing," said the soldier quickly. "At least nothing worth hearing." "Monkey's paw?" said Mrs. White curiously. "Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps," said the sergeant major without first stopping to think. His 3 listeners leaned forward excitedly. Deep in thought, the visitor put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. Mr. White filled it for him again. "To look at it," said the sergeant major, feeling about in his pocket, "it's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy." He took something out of his pocket and held it out for them. Mrs. White drew back with a look of disgust, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. "And what is there special about it?" asked Mr. White as he took it from his son and, having examined it, placed it upon the table. "It had a spell put on it by an old fakir," said the sergeant major. "A very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who tried to change it would be sorry. He put a spell on it so that 3 different men could each have 3 wishes from it." The way he told the story showed that he truly believed it, and his listeners became aware that their light laughter was out of place and had hurt him a little. "Well, why don't you have 3, sir?" said Herbert cleverly. The soldier looked at him the way that the middle-aged usually look at disrespectful youth. "I have," he said quietly, and his face whitened. And did you really have the 3 wishes granted? Asked Mrs. White. I did, said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. And has anybody else wished? Continued the old lady. The first man had his 3 wishes, yes, was the reply. I don't know what the first 2 were, but the 3rd was for death. That's how I got the paw. His voice was so serious that the group fell quiet. If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris, said the old man at last. What do you keep it for? The soldier shook his head. Fancy, I suppose, he said slowly. I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It's caused me enough trouble already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's just a story, some of them, and those who do think anything of it want to try it first and pay me afterward. If you could have another 3 wishes, said the old man, watching him carefully, would you have them? I don't know, said the other. I don't know. He took the paw, and holding it between his front finger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. Mr. White, with a slight cry, quickly bent down and took it off. Better let it burn, said the soldier sadly, but in a way that let them know he believed it to be true. If you don't want it, Morris, said the other, give it to me. I won't, said his friend with stubborn determination. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't hold me responsible for what happens. Throw it on the fire like a sensible man. The other shook his head and examined his possession closely. How do you do it? He asked. Hold it up in your right hand and state your wish out loud so that you can be heard, said the sergeant major. But I warn you of what might happen. Sounds like the Arabian Nights, said Mrs. White, as she rose and began to set the dinner. Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me? Her husband drew the talisman out of his pocket, and all 3 laughed loudly as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. If you must wish, he demanded, wish for something sensible. Mr. White dropped it back into his pocket, and placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of dinner, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the 3 sat fascinated as they listened to more of the soldier's adventures in India. If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us, said Herbert, as the door closed behind their guest just in time to catch the last train, well, we shouldn't make much out of it. Did you give him anything for it, dear? Asked Mrs. White, watching her husband closely. A little, said he, coloring slightly. He didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away. Not likely, said Herbert with pretend horror. Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Smiling, he said, we should be a king, father, to begin with, then mother can complain all the time. He ran quickly around the table, chased by the laughing Mrs. White, armed with a piece of cloth. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it doubtfully. I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact, he said slowly. It seems to me I've got all I want. If you only paid off the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you? Said Herbert, with his hand on his shoulder. Wish for $200, then, that'll just do it. His father, smiling with an embarrassed look for his foolishness and believing the soldier's story, held up the talisman. Herbert, with a serious face, spoiled only by a quick smile to his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few grand chords. I wish for $200, said the old man clearly. A fine crash from the piano greeted his words, broken by a frightened cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him. It moved, he cried, with a look of horror at the object as it lay on the floor. As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake. Well, I don't see the money, said his son, as he picked it up and placed it on the table. And I bet I never will. It must have been your imagination, dear, said his wife, regarding him worriedly. He shook his head. Never mind, though, there's no harm done, but it gave me a shock all the same. They sat down by the fire again while father and son finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man jumped nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. An unusual and depressing silence settled on all three, which lasted until the older couple got up to go to bed. "I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed," said Herbert as he wished them good night, "and something horrible sitting on top of your wardrobe watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten money." Herbert, who normally had a playful nature and didn't like to take things too seriously, sat alone in the darkness looking into the dying fire. He saw faces in it, the last so horrible and so monkey-like that he stared at it in amazement. It became so clear that, with a nervous laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing some water to throw over it. His hand found the monkey's paw, and with a little shake of his body, he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. Part 2. The next morning, in the brightness of the wintry sun streaming over the breakfast table, he laughed at his fears. The room felt as it always had, and there was an air of health and happiness which was not there the previous night. The dirty, dried-up little paw was thrown on the cabinet with a carelessness which indicated no great belief in what good it could do. "I suppose all old soldiers are the same," said Mrs. White. "The idea of our listening to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could $200 hurt you, Father?" "Might drop on his head from the sky," said Herbert. "Morris said the things happened so naturally," said his father, "that you might, if you so wished, not see the relationship." "Well, don't break into the money before I come back," said Herbert as he rose from the table to go to work. "I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, greedy old man, and we shall have to tell everyone that we don't know you." His mother laughed, and following him to the door, watched him go down the road, and returning to the breakfast table, she felt very happy at the expense of her husband's readiness to believe such stories, all of which did not prevent her from hurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor, when she found that the post brought only a bill, talking about how sergeant majors can develop bad drinking habits after they leave the army. "Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home," she said as they sat at dinner. "I know," said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer. "But for all that, the thing moved in my hand, that I'll swear to." "You thought it did," said his wife, trying to calm him. "I say it did," he replied. "There was no thought about it. I just—" "What's the matter?" His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside who, looking in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. Thinking of the $200, she noticed that the stranger was well-dressed and wore a silk hat of shiny newness. 3 times he stopped briefly at the gate, then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then with sudden firmness of mind pushed it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White, at the same moment, placed her hands behind her, hurriedly untied the strings of her apron and put it on under the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed a little uncomfortable, into the room. He looked at her in a way that said there was something about his purpose that he wanted to keep secret, and seemed to be thinking of something else as the woman said she was sorry for the appearance of the room in her husband's coat, which he usually wore in the garden. She then waited as patiently as she could for him to state his business, but he was at first strangely silent. I was asked to call," he said at last, and bent down and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers. "I came from Ma and Megan's." The lady jumped suddenly, as in alarm. "Is anything the matter?" she asked breathlessly. "Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it?" Her husband spoke before the man could answer. There, Mother," he said hurriedly. "Sit down. Don't jump to a conclusion. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure," and eyed the other, expecting that it was bad news, but hoping he was wrong. "I'm sorry," began the visitor. "Is he hurt?" demanded the mother wildly. The visitor lowered and raised his head once in agreement. "Badly hurt," he said quietly, "but he is not in any pain." "Oh, thank God!" said the woman, pressing her hands together tightly. "Thank God for that! Just think—" She broke off as the tragic meaning of the part about him not being in pain came to her. The man had turned his head slightly so as not to look directly at her, but she saw the awful truth in his face. She caught her breath, and turning to her husband, who did not yet understand the man's meaning, laid her shaking hand on his. There was a long silence. "He was caught in the machinery," said the visitor at length in a low voice. "Caught in the machinery?" repeated Mr. White, too shocked to think clearly. "Yes." He sat staring out the window, and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he used to do when he was trying to win her love in the time before they were married, nearly 40 years before. "He was the only one left to us," he said, turning gently to the visitor. "It's hard." The other coughed, and, rising, walked slowly to the window. "The firm wishes me to pass on their great sadness about your loss," he said, without looking around. "I ask that you to please understand I am only their servant and simply doing what they told me to do." There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring, and her breath unheard. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend the sergeant major might have carried into his first battle. "I was to say that Ma and Megan's accept no responsibility," continued the other, "but although they don't believe that they have a legal requirement to make a payment to you for your loss, in view of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum." Mr. White dropped his wife's hand, and rising to his feet, stared with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words, "How much?" $200 was the answer. Without hearing his wife scream, the man smiled weakly, put out his hands like a blind man, and fell, a senseless mass, to the floor. Part 3. In the huge new cemetery, some 2 miles away, the couple buried their son, and came back to the house which was now full of shadows and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in a state of waiting for something else to happen, something else which was to lighten this load too heavy for their hearts to bear. But the days passed, and they realized that they had to accept the situation, the hopeless acceptance of their only son's death. Sometimes they hardly said a word to each other, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long and tiring. It was about a week after that when the man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and he could hear the sound of his wife crying quietly at the window. He raised himself in bed and listened. "Come back," he said tenderly. "You'll be cold." "It is colder for my son," said the woman, who began crying again. The sounds of crying died away on his ears. The bed was warm, and his eyes heavy with sleep. He slept lightly at first, and then was fully asleep until a sudden wild cry from his wife woke him with a start. "The paw!" she cried wildly. "The monkey's paw!" He started up in alarm. Where is it? What's the matter?" She almost fell as she came, hurried across the room toward him. "I want it," she said. "You've not destroyed it, have you?" "No," he replied. "It's in the living room, on the shelf above the fireplace, but why?" She cried and laughed at the same time, and bending over, kissed his cheek. "I only just thought of it," she said. "Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?" "Think of what?" he questioned. "The other 2 wishes," she replied quickly. "We've only had one." "Was not that enough?" he demanded angrily. "No," she cried excitedly. "We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly, and wish our boy alive again." The man sat up in bed and threw the blankets from his shaking legs. "Good God, you're mad," he cried, struck with horror. "Get it," she said, breathing quickly. "Get it quickly and wish, oh, my boy, my boy." Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. "Get back to bed," he said, his voice shaking. "You don't know what you're saying." "We had the first wish granted," said the woman desperately. "Why not the second?" "It was a coincidence," said the man. "Go and get it, and wish," cried his wife, shaking with excitement. The man turned and looked at her, and his voice shook. "He's been dead 10 days, and besides, I would not tell you before, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, why now? Bring him back, cried the old woman, and pulled him towards the door. Do you think I fear the child I have nursed? So he went down in the darkness, and felt his way to the living room, and then to the fireplace. The talisman was in the place on the shelf, and then a horrible fear came over him that the unspoken wish might bring the broken body of his son before him before he could escape from the room. He caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door. His forehead cold with sweat. He felt his way around the table and along the walls until he found himself at the bottom of the stairs with the evil thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her. "Wish!" she cried in a strong voice. "It is foolish and wicked," he said weakly. "Wish!" repeated his wife. He raised his hand. "I wish to have my son alive again." The talisman fell to the floor, and he looked at it fearfully. Then he sank into a chair, and the old woman, with burning eyes, walked to the window and opened the curtains. He sat until he could no longer bear the cold, looking up from time to time at the figure of his wife staring through the window. The candle, which had almost burned to the bottom, was throwing moving shadows around the room. When the candle finally went out, the old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, went slowly back to his bed, and a minute afterward, the old woman came silently and lay without movement beside him. Neither spoke, but lay silently listening to the ticking of the clock. They heard nothing else other than the normal night sounds. The darkness was depressing, and after lying for some time, building up his courage, the husband took the box of matches and, lighting one, went downstairs for another candle. At the foot of the stairs, the match went out, and he stopped to light another, and at the same moment, a knock sounded on the front door. It was so quiet that it could only be heard downstairs, as if the one knocking wanted to keep their coming a secret. The matches fell from his hand. He stood motionless, not even breathing, until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and ran quickly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house. "What's that?" cried the woman, sitting up quickly. "A rat," said the man shakily. "A rat. It passed me on the stairs." His wife sat up in bed listening. A loud knock echoed through the house. "It's Herbert!" she screamed. "It's Herbert!" She ran to the door, but her husband was there before her, and catching her by the arm, held her tightly. "What are you going to do?" he asked in a low, scared voice. "It's my boy. It's Herbert," she cried, struggling automatically. "I forgot he was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go! I must open the door." "For God's sake, don't let it in!" cried the old man, shaking with fear. "You're afraid of your own son?" she cried, struggling. "Let me go! I'm coming, Herbert, I'm coming!" There was another knock, and another. The woman, with a sudden pull, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the top of the stairs and called after her as she hurried down. He heard the chain pulled back and the bottom lock open. Then the old woman's voice, desperate and breathing heavily. "The top lock!" she cried loudly. "Come down, I can't reach it!" But her husband was on his hands and knees, feeling around wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If only he could find it before the thing outside got in. The knocks came very quickly now, echoing through the house, and he heard the noise of his wife moving a chair and putting it down against the door. He heard the movement of the lock as she began to open it, and at the same moment, he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking stopped suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair pulled back, and the door opened. A cold wind blew up the staircase, and a long, loud cry of disappointment and pain from his wife gave him the courage to run down to her side, and then to the gate. The streetlight opposite shone on a quiet and very deserted road. Be careful with your wishes, my friend, for you just might receive them all. The end.
The Monkey's Paw, written by W. Jacobs, is a Wisdom Harbour audio production. Produced by Matt Limpert, narrated by Briley Crisafi. So happy Halloween! I'm Andy Andrews, the professional noticer, harnessing common sense and wisdom to plow through challenges all the way to an answer for you. And I think that'll do it for this week. Get us out of here, Matthew. So, ladies and gentlemen, and to the boys and girls who aspire to become ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the end of another episode of The Professional Noticer. In a world where common sense has become a superpower, I'm harnessing that tiny bit of mental energy I have for you, seeking wisdom, making observations, and endeavoring to answer tough questions in a way that will empower your family and your business. I'm Andy Andrews. Until next week, goodbye. This episode of The Professional Noticer was produced by Matt Limpert. The Noticer theme, written and performed by Sugarcane Jane. Pumpkin Spice Stress Balls for the cast and crew, provided by Twinkle and Smoke of Beverly Hills. Additional financial consideration provided by Spooky Doom Deja Boom, the world's first costume that brings your embarrassing memories back to life. Relive the horror of calling your teacher Mom, the regret of sending that "you up" text to your ex, or the sheer panic of realizing you hit reply all to a private email at work. With customizable sound effects, flashing guilt lights, and nonstop voice reminders like "bad choice, buddy," you'll be the life and the cringe of every Halloween party. But act fast. Order now and we'll throw in the Ghost of Cringing Moments Past add-on pack featuring all your worst moments on loop. Because nothing says spooky like your high school talent show disaster or that time you overshared on a first date. Spooky Doom, Deja Boom. This year, don't just wear a costume, wear a mistake.